Sometimes the greatest terror is not what waits behind a locked door, but what memory convinces us is already there. Spring, 1945. The war in Europe had fallen silent, but inside the minds of thousands, it continued with every unfamiliar sound, every shouted order, and every heavy door that closed behind them. A convoy of olive-drab army trucks rolled through the gates of a temporary American processing camp somewhere in western Germany, tires crunching over pale gravel still damp from the previous night's rain. The morning air carried the scent of wet earth, canvas, and fresh-cut pine. A faint layer of mist drifted between rows of neatly painted wooden buildings, softening the edges of guard towers that stood watch without urgency. There were no raised voices, no barking dogs, only the distant hum of generators and the rhythmic clatter of boots moving with practiced routine. Inside the final truck sat Anna Keller, 24 years old, her pale hands folded tightly in her lap. Once a military nurse, she now stared through narrow wooden slats at a place she could not understand. Beside her, several other German women remained silent, their faces drawn with exhaustion after weeks of transport across shattered roads. Dust clung to worn coats. Their eyes rarely met. They had survived bombardments, displacement, hunger, and uncertainty, but what frightened them now was not another battlefield. It was the unknown. The truck slowed to a stop, and for several long seconds, no one moved. The tailgate lowered with a metallic clang that echoed across the compound. An American soldier extended a hand, not to force anyone forward, but simply to steady the first woman as she climbed down. Most ignored the gesture. Fear had become stronger than courtesy. Anna stepped onto the gravel and immediately noticed something that did not fit the story she had heard for years. Flower beds bordered the administration building. Fresh laundry swayed gently on clotheslines behind one of the barracks. Somewhere beyond the fence, she heard laughter. Real laughter. It sounded strangely ordinary, almost out of place in a world that had forgotten normal life. The women were quietly assembled into a single line. No one rushed them. No rifle pointed them toward the next building. A young American corporal checked names against a clipboard, while another handed each woman a folded towel and a small wrapped bar of soap. Anna looked down at the soap without touching it. It smelled faintly of lavender, even through the paper wrapping. She could not remember the last time she had smelled anything so clean. Ahead stood a long wooden structure with narrow windows clouded by warm steam. Moisture escaped beneath the doorway and drifted into the cool morning air. Water trickled somewhere inside. Pipes rattled softly behind the walls. One by one, the women noticed the same details. Steam, closed doors, concrete floors, white-tiled walls barely visible through the glass. No explanation came immediately. The silence grew heavier than any command. Anna felt her breathing become shallow. Her heartbeat echoed louder than the footsteps surrounding her. Somewhere behind the line, someone whispered a single German word almost too quietly to hear. Another woman slowly lifted her eyes toward the building. No one spoke again. Yet something invisible had already begun moving through the line, passing from one frightened face to the next faster than any spoken order ever could. Anna did not know who had whispered the word first. She only knew that once it reached her ears, it refused to leave. The sound settled over the line of women like an invisible fog, changing the meaning of everything around them. The steam drifting beneath the wooden door no longer suggested warm water. The tiled walls glimpsed through the narrow windows no longer looked clean. Every ordinary detail became something else once fear supplied its own explanation. The woman standing beside Anna slowly tightened her grip around the folded towel until her knuckles turned pale. Another quietly shook her head before anyone had spoken a single instruction. No one wanted to be the first to move. The American corporal looked up from his clipboard, sensing that something had shifted. A moment earlier the line had been merely tired. Now every face carried the same frozen expression, as though each woman had reached the same terrible conclusion without exchanging more than a glance. Anna heard water flowing somewhere inside the building. It echoed softly through metal pipes before disappearing again. The sound reminded her of hospitals before the war, when hot water had meant comfort, clean bandages, and recovery. Those memories tried to surface, but years of hardship pressed them back beneath darker ones. Memory did not ask permission. It arrived on its own terms. A gust of cool morning air moved across the compound, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Somewhere nearby, an American mechanic laughed while repairing a military truck. Another soldier carried a crate of canned food across the yard. Their routine continued unchanged, completely unaware of the storm building only a few yards away. Anna studied their faces from a distance. None appeared hurried. None seemed angry. Yet certainty had become impossible. She had learned long ago that appearances could not always be trusted. The woman behind her began breathing faster. Another quietly murmured a prayer beneath her breath. A towel slipped from someone's trembling hands and landed on the gravel without a sound. No one bent down to pick it up. The silence itself seemed louder than any command. Then one of the camp attendants stepped toward the doorway and pulled it open. Warm air drifted outside, carrying the unmistakable scent of soap and clean water. White steam rolled gently into the cool morning light before dissolving above the gravel path. Inside, rows of simple showerheads lined spotless tiled walls beneath bright electric lights. Everything looked ordinary, almost painfully ordinary, but fear had already rewritten what their eyes believed they were seeing. Anna felt her heartbeat quicken until she could hear little else. She looked at the towel still resting in her hands, then toward the open doorway, then back at the women surrounding her. Every familiar object had become uncertain. Every ordinary sound carried hidden meaning. She swallowed carefully, trying to steady her breathing, but uncertainty spread faster than reason. Around her, anxious glances moved from face to face, each woman searching the others for reassurance that no one could honestly provide. Without realizing it, the entire line had stopped moving, suspended between the quiet reality before them and the memories they could not yet leave behind. Captain James Walker noticed the hesitation before anyone else did. From the opposite side of the courtyard, he had been reviewing intake forms with quiet efficiency when the movement of the line simply stopped. The women were no longer waiting. They were standing perfectly still, their eyes fixed on the open doorway as though an invisible barrier had formed between the gravel path and the tiled room beyond. Walker folded the clipboard beneath one arm and looked toward the nearest interpreter. Neither man understood the reason for the sudden silence. A few seconds passed. The only sounds came from dripping water inside the building and the distant chirping of birds beyond the camp fence. Then one frightened voice broke the stillness. It came from somewhere near the center of the line, soft at first, almost swallowed by trembling breath. Another woman repeated the same words, louder this time, and several heads immediately turned toward her. Panic spread without anyone raising a hand or giving an order. Fear moved from face to face through nothing more than widened eyes and hurried breathing. Anna felt the words escape before she realized she had spoken them. They were not directed at the soldiers. They were spoken into the air itself, as though memory had become stronger than the morning around her. The towel slipped from her hands and settled onto the damp gravel. Several women instinctively stepped backward instead of forward, pressing closer together until shoulders touched. One quietly covered her face. Another shook her head over and over, unable to force herself to look at the doorway again. Captain Walker immediately recognized that this was no act of defiance. He had seen fear on battlefields, exhaustion after long marches, and uncertainty among civilians returning to ruined towns. This was something entirely different. These women were not resisting instructions. They genuinely believed they were in danger. He lowered his clipboard and raised one open hand toward the guards. No one advanced. No one attempted to hurry the line. The American soldiers stopped exactly where they stood, exchanging confused glances while waiting for new instructions. Walker crossed the courtyard at a calm pace, careful not to appear rushed. His boots crunched softly across the gravel, but even that ordinary sound seemed to make several women tense. He stopped several feet away, keeping respectful distance. His expression carried more concern than authority. Looking toward the interpreter, he asked quietly, "Please find out what frightened them." The interpreter stepped forward with measured movements and addressed the women gently in German. At first, no one answered. The silence stretched until Anna finally lifted her eyes. They were filled not with anger, but with overwhelming uncertainty. Her voice barely rose above a whisper as she struggled to explain why the sight of steam, white tile, and closed doors had awakened fears that reason alone could not silence. As the interpreter listened, his expression slowly changed. He turned back toward Captain Walker, taking a careful breath before translating what he had just heard. Walker remained completely still, absorbing every word. For a long moment, he said nothing at all. The morning breeze continued drifting through the pine trees while the entire camp seemed to pause with him, waiting to see what he would do next. Captain James Walker listened without interrupting. The interpreter chose each English word carefully, as though even a small mistake might deepen the fear already filling the courtyard. When he finished speaking, silence settled over the camp once again. Walker slowly turned toward the open doorway, where warm steam continued drifting into the cool morning air. Then he looked back at the women standing shoulder to shoulder, still unable to separate the quiet building before them from the memories they carried inside. He removed his field cap for a brief moment and ran one hand across his forehead before giving his first order of the morning. "Stop the entire intake process," he said calmly. Every soldier within hearing distance immediately paused. Clipboards lowered. Boxes remained where they had been carried. No one questioned the instruction. Walker continued speaking in the same steady voice. "Open every door, every window. Leave nothing closed." Within seconds, several American soldiers crossed to the building. They pushed open both entrance doors until they rested flat against the outside walls. Windows were raised one after another, allowing sunlight to pour across the white tile inside. Fresh morning air swept through the room, carrying away much of the lingering steam. Walker then gave another unexpected instruction. "Nobody goes inside except my men." The guards exchanged curious glances, but they obeyed without hesitation. One soldier stepped into the shower room fully dressed in his work uniform. Another followed carrying a clean towel over one shoulder. A third reached toward the wall and turned a metal valve. Water immediately flowed from the shower heads with a soft, steady rhythm. The men laughed quietly about how cold the floor felt beneath their boots and continued speaking to one another with the relaxed familiarity of people performing an ordinary task. After several moments, they walked back outside completely unharmed, still smiling, still carrying the same towels they had taken in. They had not spoken to the women. They had simply allowed actions to explain what words could not. Walker knew that trust could never be demanded. It had to be demonstrated. He nodded toward the interpreter once more. "Please tell them there is no hurry. Nobody will force them to enter. They may watch for as long as they need." The message was translated slowly into German. Several women looked toward the open room again, this time noticing details hidden by fear only moments before. Sunlight reflected from polished faucets. Fresh towels rested neatly on wooden benches. A bucket filled with bars of unopened soap stood beside the entrance. The room resembled the wash facilities Walker had known throughout his military service, plain, practical, and clean. Anna remained motionless. Her breathing gradually slowed as she watched the soldiers move naturally through the room without hesitation. She noticed one young corporal absent-mindedly humming while adjusting a loose shower curtain before stepping back outside. It was such an ordinary gesture that it quietly challenged everything fear had insisted must be true. Walker said nothing further. He simply stood several yards away with his hands folded behind his back, giving the women the one thing that had been missing from so much of their recent lives. He gave them time. No one spoke when the interpreter finished. The words settled quietly over the courtyard, but they did not erase fear. They simply gave it room to breathe. Captain James Walker remained exactly where he was, refusing to shorten the distance unless someone invited him closer. He understood that every unnecessary step could feel like pressure, and pressure was the last thing these women needed. The steady sound of running water continued inside the building. It was no longer hidden behind closed doors. Sunlight streamed through the open windows, painting bright rectangles across the clean tile floor. A gentle breeze carried the scent of soap into the courtyard, mixing with pine, damp gravel, and the fresh morning air. Anna stood with her eyes fixed on the doorway. Her hands were empty now, the towel still resting where it had fallen. She remembered hospital wards before the war, where warm water had meant healing instead of uncertainty. Those memories had almost disappeared beneath years of fear, yet they had not vanished completely. Somewhere inside her, they still existed, waiting to be believed again. One of the older women quietly bent down, picked up Anna's towel, brushed away a few grains of gravel, and placed it back into her hands without saying a word. The small gesture carried more comfort than any speech could have offered. Anna looked toward her and managed the slightest nod. Around them, the others remained silent, watching the open doorway, watching the American soldiers, watching one another. Nobody wanted to make the first decision alone. Walker noticed their hesitation and simply folded his arms behind his back. He glanced toward the soldiers standing nearby and gave a subtle shake of his head. No one was to hurry them. No one was to encourage them with speeches. The quiet itself had become part of the reassurance. Several minutes passed. The water continued falling from the showerheads with the same calm rhythm. It sounded almost like gentle rain on a farmhouse roof. A young corporal stepped inside once again, adjusted one of the faucets, smiled at another soldier, and walked back into the sunlight carrying a dry towel over his shoulder. Nothing dramatic happened. Nothing unusual happened. Ordinary moments slowly challenged extraordinary fears. Anna drew one careful breath after another until her heartbeat no longer drowned out every other sound. She looked across the courtyard toward Captain Walker. He did not motion for her to come forward. He simply met her eyes with quiet patience before lowering his gaze again, allowing the choice to remain entirely hers. That single act surprised her more than anything else she had seen that morning. For the first time since arriving, she realized that no one was demanding trust. They were offering the opportunity to discover it at her own pace. She tightened her fingers around the folded towel, lifted one foot from the gravel, and took a single measured step toward the doorway. It was only a few inches, hardly noticeable to anyone outside the line, yet every woman nearby saw it. No applause followed. No command was given. The only sound remained the gentle flow of warm water waiting inside, unchanged, patient, and quietly ordinary. Anna stood at the entrance for what felt like an entire season compressed into a single minute. Warm air brushed gently across her face, carrying the clean scent of soap instead of smoke, fresh cotton instead of dust. She studied every corner of the room before allowing herself another step. White tiles reflected the morning sunlight pouring through the open windows. The polished metal pipes gleamed quietly overhead. Water continued falling in smooth silver streams, collecting in narrow floor drains before disappearing with a soft, steady murmur. Nothing inside demanded haste. Nothing inside suggested danger. Behind her, the other women watched in complete silence. They did not urge her forward. They simply waited, understanding that if one person could cross the invisible line between fear and trust, perhaps the others could follow. Captain James Walker remained outside the doorway exactly where he had been standing. He neither approached nor looked away. His patience seemed almost unusual after years during which nearly every decision in Anna's life had been made by someone else. She slowly placed the folded towel on a nearby wooden bench. Beside it rested a neatly wrapped bar of soap and a stack of freshly laundered clothing. The fabric smelled faintly of sunshine and starch, as though it had dried outdoors beneath an open sky. She reached out with cautious fingers, touching the edge of the towel before withdrawing her hand again. Every movement felt deliberate. Every ordinary object required rediscovery. The sound of water continued uninterrupted. Anna looked toward the nearest showerhead. Tiny droplets sparkled beneath the morning light before disappearing against the clean floor below. She extended one hand beneath the gentle stream. Warm water flowed across her fingers. She closed her eyes without realizing it. It was simply warm water. Nothing more. Nothing less. The realization did not arrive like a sudden revelation. It arrived quietly, almost shyly, replacing one fear at a time until there was room for another emotion she had not expected to feel. Relief. She opened her eyes again and looked back toward the doorway. One of the older women stood waiting with tears resting silently along her cheeks, not from sorrow alone, but from the exhausting release that sometimes follows long seasons of uncertainty. Anna gave the smallest nod she could manage. No words were necessary. The gesture itself became permission. One after another, the women began taking careful steps into the room. Nobody rushed. Nobody pushed. Each person crossed the threshold at her own pace, carrying invisible burdens that could not be measured by any scale or recorded on any military document. Outside, Captain Walker quietly turned the clipboard back over to the waiting corporal, but made no effort to resume the schedule immediately. He understood that some delays could never be counted as lost time. As more women entered the bright room, the atmosphere across the courtyard slowly changed. Conversation remained absent, yet the silence no longer felt trapped by fear. It became the quieter silence that sometimes follows understanding. The steady rhythm of falling water continued beneath the open windows while sunlight reached farther across the white floor, and for the first time that morning, the ordinary sounds of daily life seemed stronger than the echoes of memory. The morning slowly found its ordinary rhythm again. The sound of running water faded behind the open windows, replaced by quieter sounds that belonged to everyday life. Fresh towels were folded into neat stacks. Clean clothing was carried from one wooden shelf to another. Somewhere across the compound, a cook struck a metal spoon against a large kettle, signaling that breakfast would soon be served. The simple noise drifted through the cool air without urgency. Anna stepped back into the courtyard wearing fresh clothes that fit a little loosely but felt clean against her skin. Her damp hair rested across her shoulders as the breeze carried away the last traces of warm steam. For several seconds, she simply stood beneath the open sky. She lifted her face toward the morning sunlight, as though rediscovering something she had forgotten could still exist. Around her, the other women emerged one by one. Their expressions had not suddenly become joyful. The months behind them could not disappear in a single morning. Yet something subtle had changed. Their shoulders no longer remained locked with constant tension. Their breathing had become steadier. Some quietly exchanged small nods with one another. Others paused beside the flower beds that lined the administration building, noticing blossoms they had overlooked only an hour earlier. Captain James Walker watched the group from across the gravel path. He had processed thousands of names since joining the army, but that morning reminded him that no clipboard could record the weight people carried inside their memories. During the war, he had measured roads in miles, supplies in pounds, and schedules in minutes. None of those measurements explained why an ordinary room with white tile and warm water could become a place of overwhelming fear. He removed his gloves, folded them carefully, and slipped them into his pocket. The interpreter quietly joined him without speaking for several moments. Finally, he said, "They believed what they had prepared themselves to believe for a very long time." Walker nodded slowly. "Fear does not disappear because someone tells it to," he replied. "Sometimes it has to see something different with its own eyes." The interpreter looked toward the women now gathering near a wooden table where enamel cups had been arranged beside large coffee urns. Volunteers placed fresh bread, butter, and bowls of oatmeal along the center of the table. Nothing about the meal was extravagant. It was simply warm, orderly, and waiting. Anna accepted an enamel cup with both hands. Heat spread gently through her fingers. The aroma of fresh coffee rose with the morning air. She closed her eyes for a brief moment before taking a careful sip. Across the table, one of the older women smiled faintly for what seemed like the first time in many months. No speeches were given. No ceremony marked the moment. The camp simply continued its quiet routine, while strangers slowly learned that ordinary kindness often speaks more clearly than extraordinary promises. Captain Walker glanced once more toward the open shower building before an orderly closed the windows for the afternoon. The room looked exactly as it had looked all morning. Nothing inside had changed. Yet for everyone standing in the courtyard, it no longer represented the same thing. The building had remained unchanged. The people who walked away from it had not. The afternoon sun climbed higher, washing the camp in a softer golden light that made the freshly painted buildings seem less like military structures and more like ordinary places where ordinary days unfolded. Laundry fluttered gently between wooden posts. Somewhere beyond the supply shed, a mechanic tightened the hood of a truck while humming a tune too distant to recognize. The steady rhythm of daily work returned as if the morning had been only another page in a much longer story. Anna sat quietly on the edge of a wooden bench beneath the shade of a tall pine tree, her enamel coffee cup resting between both hands. The warmth had long since faded from the drink, yet she continued holding it, grateful for its simple weight. Across the courtyard, Captain James Walker reviewed reports at a folding table. His pencil moved across the paper with practiced precision, but every few moments his eyes drifted toward the women settling into the calm routine of the camp. He realized he had spent years believing that victory was measured by territory gained or battles concluded. That morning had quietly suggested another measure entirely. Sometimes victory meant giving frightened people enough patience to discover safety for themselves. The interpreter approached Anna with careful steps, and asked whether she wished to speak with the captain. She hesitated only briefly before rising from the bench. Her footsteps carried her across the gravel path until she stopped several feet from Walker's table. He immediately stood, setting his paperwork aside. There was no ceremony, no salute, no formal introduction. Only two strangers standing beneath the same afternoon sky after sharing an unforgettable morning. Through the interpreter, Anna searched for words that seemed far too small for what she wished to express. Finally, she said, "When I first saw the building, I believed the worst because fear had become easier to believe than hope." The interpreter translated slowly. Walker listened without interrupting. After a thoughtful pause, he answered in the same calm voice the women had heard throughout the day. Fear often survives long after danger has passed. It does not disappear because someone orders it to disappear. The interpreter repeated his words in German. Anna lowered her eyes for a moment before quietly asking another question. "Why did you stop everything for us?" Walker glanced across the courtyard where soldiers continued carrying supplies, repairing equipment, and preparing evening meals. "Because schedules can wait," he replied. "People cannot." The interpreter smiled faintly before translating once more. Anna remained silent, absorbing the simplicity of the answer. No long explanation followed. None was needed. She extended her hand cautiously. Walker accepted the handshake with quiet respect, neither firm nor hesitant, simply natural. It lasted only a moment before they stepped back again. Around them, life inside the camp continued without pause. A cook opened the kitchen door, releasing the inviting aroma of fresh bread into the cool afternoon breeze. Somewhere nearby, a robin landed on the fence and began singing as though the world had always been peaceful. Anna looked toward the open sky, realizing that the memories she carried would not disappear in a single day. They would remain with her for years. Yet another memory had joined them now, one that did not erase the past but stood beside it. It was the memory of ordinary kindness expressed through quiet actions, patient silence, and the simple decision to let another human being choose trust instead of demanding it. Years passed, and the war gradually became something people measured in history books, faded photographs, and quiet anniversaries instead of daily headlines. Cities were rebuilt. Families found one another again, while others carried empty places that could never be filled. Yet among all the memories Anna Keller carried into the years that followed, one ordinary morning remained brighter than many extraordinary events. It was never the uniforms she remembered most clearly. It was never the buildings or the camp itself. It was the moment when someone chose patience instead of pressure. Long after she returned to civilian life, she occasionally paused whenever warm water flowed from a faucet or sunlight reflected across white tile. Those simple details no longer awakened fear. Instead, they reminded her that even after years of suspicion, trust could begin with something as small as an open door left standing wide beneath the morning sky. She often thought about Captain James Walker without knowing where life had taken him. Perhaps he had returned to a small town somewhere in America. Perhaps he had resumed an ordinary profession far removed from military service. She imagined him walking through grocery stores, attending church on quiet Sundays, greeting neighbors who would never know that one ordinary decision made during one ordinary morning had quietly changed the lives of strangers he would likely never meet again. Walker also remembered that day from time to time. Years later, while sorting old papers from his military service, he found a faded intake report from the temporary processing camp. Most of the names on the page meant little after so much time had passed. Yet he remembered the faces. He remembered the silence. More than anything, he remembered discovering that not every wound could be seen beneath a bandage or measured by a physician. Some injuries lived inside memory itself, invisible but no less real. He carefully folded the paper once again and returned it to its envelope, understanding that the most meaningful moments of his service had rarely appeared in official reports. They had existed quietly between the lines. Across different countries and different futures, neither Anna nor James became famous. Their paths never crossed again. The world continued moving forward exactly as it always does. Seasons changed. Children grew up. New generations inherited stories from people who had lived through extraordinary years. Whenever Anna chose to speak about the war, she rarely described battles or politics. Instead, she spoke about a morning when fear entered a courtyard before she did, and about how patience slowly walked it back out again. She told her listeners that dignity sometimes arrives without speeches, without applause, and without anyone noticing except the people who needed it most. Those who heard her often expected dramatic endings or remarkable heroes. She simply smiled and shook her head. Real change, she would say, rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly through ordinary actions repeated with compassion. And perhaps that is why the memory never faded. Buildings weather with time. Uniforms become museum pieces. Documents turn yellow with age. Yet one act of simple humanity can remain clear for an entire lifetime, reminding us that the strongest victories are not always won by force. Sometimes they are won by choosing to see another person not as an enemy, but simply as another human being. The quiet ones are never truly ordinary, because they leave behind something louder than words. They leave behind a higher standard for everyone who comes after them.